Okay, here we go with Watership Down Audio 4. This is called In the Woods. But first, a little something from R.M. Lockley on a book called The Private Life of the Rabbits. These young rabbits must move out if they are to survive. In a wild and free state, they stray sometimes for miles, wandering until they find a suitable environment. This is for R.M. Lockley in a book called The Private Life of the Rabbit. Onward, here we go. It was getting towards moonset when they left the fields and entered the wood, straggling, catching up with one or another, keeping more or less together. They had wandered over half a mile down the fields, always following the course of the brook. Although Hazel guessed that they must now have gone further from the warren than any rabbit he ever talked to. He was not sure whether they are yet safely away, or it was while he was wondering, not for the first time, whether he could hear sounds of pursuit, that he first noticed the dark masses of trees and the brook disappearing amongst them. The rabbits avoid close woodland, where the ground is shady, damp, and grassless. They felt menaced by the of the undergrowth. Hazel did not care for the look of the trees. Still, he thought Holly would no doubt think twice before following them into a place like that. And to keep beside the brook might well prove safer than wandering about in the field in one direction or another, with the risk of finding themselves in the end back at the warren. He decided to go straight into the wood without consulting Bigwig, and to trust that the rest will follow. If we don't run into trouble and the brook takes us through the woods, he thought, we really shall be clear of the warren, and then we can look for somewhere to rest a bit. Most of them seem to be more or less all right, though Fiver and Pipkin will have had a much as they can stand before long. From the moment he entered it, the wood seems full of noise. There was a smell of damp leaves and moss, and everywhere the splash of water went whispering about. Just inside the brook made a little fall into a pond, and the sound enclosed amongst the trees echoed as if it was a cave. Roosting birds rustled overhead, and the night breeze stirred the leaves here and there. A twig fell, and there was more sinister and unidentified sounds from further away, sounds of movement. To the rabbits, everything unknown is dangerous. The first reaction is to startle, the second to bolt, and again they were startled until they were close to exhaustion. But what did these sounds mean, and where? In this wilderness, could they bolt to? The rabbits cracked together, and their progress grew slower. Before long, they lost the course of the brook, slipping across the moonlit patches as fugitives and halting in the bushes with raised ears and staring eyes. The moon was low now, and the light, wherever it slanted through the trees, seemed thicker, older, and more yellow. From the thick pile of dead leaves beneath a holly tree, Hazel looked down the narrow path lined on either side of the fern and sprouting fireweed. The fern moved slightly in the breeze, but along the path there was nothing to be seen except a scatter of last year's fallen acorns under the oak. What was in the bracken? What lay round the further bend? And what would happen to a rabbit who left the shelter of the holly tree and ran down the path? He turned to Dandelion beside him. "You better wait here," he says. "When I get to that bend, I'll stamp. But if I run into trouble, get the others away." Without waiting for an answer, he ran to the open and down the path. A few seconds brought him to the oak. He paused a moment, staring about him, and then ran over to the bend. Beyond the path was the same, empty, darkening moonlight, and leading gently downhill to a steep shadow of a grove of inex trees. Hazel stamped, and a few moments later, Dandelion was beside him in the bracken. Even in the midst of his fears and strain, it occurred to him that Dandelion must be very fast. He covered the distance in a flash. "Well done," whispered Dandelion. "Running the risk for us. Are you like El Helera?" Now, this down here in notes says, this stresses are the same as in the phrase, never say die. It's basically what that means. Hazel gave him a quick, friendly glance, and it was a warm praise and cheered him. What Robin Hood is to the English, John Henry to the American Negroes, El Helera, the prince of 1,000 enemies, to rabbits. Uncle Remus might have heard of him, for some of El Helera's adventures are those of the Briar Rabbit. For that matter, Ulysses himself may have borrowed a trick or two from the rabbit hero, for he is very old and is never at a loss for a trick to deceive his enemies. Once, they say, he had to get home by swimming across a great river where there was a large, hungry pike. El Helera combed himself until he had enough fur to cover a clay rabbit, and he pushed into the water. The pike rushed it and bit it and left it in disgust. After a little, it drifted to the bank, and El Helera dragged it out and waited a while before pushing it in again. After an hour of this, the pike left it alone. And when it was done so the 5th time, El Helera swam across himself and went home. Some rabbits say that he controls the weather, because the wind, the damp, and the dew are friends and instruments to rabbits against their enemies. "Hazel, we'll have to stop here," says Bigwig, coming up between the panting and crouching bodies of the others. "I know it's not a good place, but Fiber and this other half-sized fellow you got here, they're pretty well in. They won't be able to go on if they don't rest." The truth was, every one of them was tired. Many rabbits spend all their lives in the same place and never run more than a few hundred yards at a stretch. Even though they might live and sleep above ground for months at a time, they prefer not to be out of distance of some sort of refuge that will serve as a hole. They have two natural gaits. The gentle looping forward motion of the warren on a summer evening, and a lightning dash for cover that every human has seen some time or another. It is difficult to imagine a rabbit plodding steadily along, but they are not built for it. It is true that young rabbits are great migrants and capable of journeying for miles, but they do not take to it readily. Hazel and his companions had spent the night doing everything that came unnaturally to them, and this was for the first time. They had been moving in a group or trying to they had staggered widely at times. They had been trying to maintain a steady pace between hopping and running. It has become hard. And since entering the wood, it has been with severe anxiety. Several were almost starving as it was, in that state of staring, gazing paralysis that comes over terrified and exhausted rabbits. To what they sit and watch their enemies, weasels or humans, approach to take their lives. Pipkin was trembling under the fern, his ears drooping from either side of his head. He held one forepaw forward in an awkward, unnatural way and kept licking it miserably. Piper was a little better off. He was still cheerful but very wary. Hazel realized that until they had rested, they would all be safer where they were than stumbling along in the open with no strength left to run from an enemy. But if they lay brooding, unable to feed or go underground, then all their troubles would have come crowding into their hearts. Their fears would mount, and they might very likely scatter or even try to return to the warren. He had an idea. Yes, well, we all will rest here, he said. Let's go in amongst this fern. Come on, Dandelion, tell us a story. I hear you're very handy that way. Pipkin here can't wait to hear it. Dandelion looked at Pipkin and realized it was what Hazel was asking him to do, choking back his own fear of desolate, grassless woodland and the before-dawn returning of owls that they could hear some way off, and the extraordinary rank animal smell that seemed to come from somewhere rather near. He began. That is the end of number 5. Now, if you all remember, all you Witcher players, how come everybody named Dandelion seems to be some sort of storyteller? I think that's where they got the Witcher thing from. They had to get it from Watership Down because Dandelion does a lot of stories.
Yeah, and the Witcher was written in the 90s, and Watership Down was early 70s or late 60s. So yeah, Dandelion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I prefer this Dandelion over the Witcher Dandelion.
Yeah, because Dandelion in the book, he's brave. I'll put on a performance even though I want to shit my pants.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Dandelion in the Witcher series is, I'll bullshit my way out of it, I'll make myself out to be the hero, and I'll never ever get hurt.
Wow. So, any other thoughts about this? They're on their way. They're in the woods. They seem to be doing okay for now.
Yeah, they're off to a good start.
Yeah, at least they're away from the Owsla, away from the
wrath of Captain Holly.
Wrath of Captain Holly. Yeah, that's what happens when you beat up the police and you take off. Yeah. You know, at least these rabbits have more guts than Antiba does. Yeah. That's for sure. That's for sure. Ladies and gentlemen, that was another audiobook of Watership Down, and it's going to definitely get a lot more interesting in the next couple of episodes, especially the telling of El Helera, the Prince of Rabbits. We'll be hearing that story from Dandelion here. Nichols will say, of course.